Picture a Viking raid. You already have the image. Dragon-headed ships appearing out of the fog, warriors pouring onto the beach, screaming, fire, chaos. Total, mindless violence. That image is not exactly wrong, but it's missing almost everything that made these raids actually work, because the real Viking raid was quieter than that. It was planned months in advance. It was timed to a calendar. And in some cases, it was practically running on a schedule, like a tax collection. This video is about the parts of Viking raids that the documentaries skip, not the swords and the burning, the reconnaissance, the kidnapping economics, the protection payments made in butter. And one fact near the end of this about who was actually paying for some of these raids, that is going to change how you see the entire Viking Age. And to be clear up front, this isn't a Vikings were misunderstood video. The violence was real. People died, and thousands were dragged off into slavery. The uncomfortable truth is not that the raids were gentler than you think. It's that they were better organized than anyone wants to admit. Let's start before the raid. Long before. Because the most important part of a Viking raid happened months earlier, and it didn't involve a single weapon. It involved a merchant. Viking intelligence came from trade. The same networks that moved furs and silver across Europe doubled as a reconnaissance system. Knowledge about a target came from merchants who had visited the area, from previous raids, or from scouting parties sent out shortly before an attack. Which means the friendly northern trader who visited your coastal town last summer, who admired your church, who asked polite questions about the harvest and the local lord, may have been the reason your monastery was chosen this summer. The monastery wasn't found. It was selected. And once it was selected, the attack followed a fixed pattern. This is documented. The raiders would scout the target, set up an overnight camp nearby, and strike early in the morning, before the population had started their daily routine. Not because dawn is dramatic, because of logistics. Early morning meant everyone was still in one place. Farmers hadn't left for the fields. The wealthy hadn't dispersed. Everyone the raiders wanted, the ransomable and the saleable, was conveniently gathered together. And that word, gathered, leads to the darkest scheduling trick in the whole playbook. Vikings timed raids to the Christian calendar. Feast days meant full churches. Full churches meant the entire town in one building, the valuables on display, and everyone's attention pointed at the altar. When Vikings hit the city of Nantes in 843, they attacked on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, while the city was packed with worshippers and the bishop was killed at the altar in the middle of Mass. The church calendar told you exactly where everyone would be and exactly when they would be there. To a raid planner, a holy day wasn't sacred. It was a timetable. Then there's the speed. And this is the part that made defending against them essentially impossible. Everyone knows longships were fast on water. If you saw the last video on this channel, you know exactly how fast. What almost nobody talks about is what happened when the target wasn't on the coast. If the monastery sat inland, away from the river, the crews would beach the ships, spread out, and round up every local horse they could find. And then the sea raiders became cavalry, mounted, mobile, and closing in on a target that assumed distance meant safety. Coastal defense was built on the assumption that you had time once the ships were spotted. Stolen horses erased that assumption. They were fast on water, and then they were fast on land, riding the victim's own animals. Now, the raid itself. And here is where the popular image really falls apart. Because the goal of a Viking raid was usually not to kill everyone. Killing everyone was bad business. Multiple sources indicate that Vikings often went out of their way to spare the monks in the monasteries they attacked. The Norse honor code gave no credit for killing unarmed prisoners. And more to the point, a live monk was merchandise. He could be sold as a slave, or, if the raiders got lucky, ransomed back at an enormous markup. A dead monk was worth nothing. And when I say enormous markup, I mean this. In 858, Vikings captured the abbot of St. Denis and his brother. The ransom paid for those two men came to 686 pounds of gold and 3,250 pounds of silver. 2 prisoners. That single ransom was worth more than the loot of entire raids. Kidnapping wasn't a side effect of raiding. In many cases, kidnapping was the point. And it scaled. In one raid on Armagh in Ireland in 869, Vikings carried off more than 1,000 people. Not killed, carried off. 1,000 human beings taken in a single operation, destined for ransom or the slave markets. These weren't smash and grab attacks. They were harvesting expeditions. And then there's my favorite detail in this entire subject, the one that shows exactly how sharp these people were commercially. Vikings in Ireland learned to ransom saints' relics. Think about what a relic is to a raider. The bones of a dead holy man, a shriveled body part in a decorated box. Zero melt value. The gold box, sure, you take that. But the bones inside are, from a Viking point of view, garbage. Except they noticed something. The Christians would pay for the garbage. To the local community, that relic was the single most precious object in the region, more valuable than the silver it sat in. So instead of dumping the bones, the raiders started selling them back. The saint himself became a hostage. If you want a single image that captures what Viking raids actually were, it's not a burning monastery. It's a negotiation over the price of a dead man's finger bone, which brings us to the money. Because once raiding became this profitable, the smartest people on both sides realized something. You didn't actually need the raid at all. You could just pay. The payments became famous under the name Danegeld. Charles the Bald paid 7,000 pounds of silver to get the Vikings to leave Paris in 845. English kings would eventually pay sums so large they had to invent new taxes to cover them. And the payments didn't only come from kings. Smaller communities that couldn't produce silver on demand paid Viking fleets in what they had. Irish records describe monasteries handing over cattle, grain, salted butter, and hard cheese to warbands anchored offshore. A crew that had been at sea for weeks needed food as much as treasure, and the monks understood that. Picture it: a fleet of dragon ships sitting in your bay, and the negotiation that saves your community is conducted in dairy products. But here's the catch, and every ruler who paid learned it the hard way. Paying worked once, and then it guaranteed they came back. A payment was an advertisement. It marked you as a target that pays. Some regions ended up being raided or threatened on something close to a schedule. Less like war, more like a subscription you couldn't cancel. And now the fact I promised you, the one about who was actually paying. In 886, the Vikings had Paris under pressure, and the Frankish Emperor Charles the Fat arrived to deal with them. He paid them 700 pounds of silver to leave. Standard practice by then. But that's not all he did. He also granted them permission to sail on and plunder Burgundy, a region of his own empire, a region that happened to be in revolt against him. Read that again. A Christian emperor paid a Viking fleet, and part of the deal was pointing them at his own rebellious province, like a weapon. The raiders everyone remembers as the wild men of the north were, by that point, something closer to contractors. Muscle for hire, operating in the middle of European politics, funded by the very kingdoms they were supposedly terrorizing. So here's what we actually know. The Viking raid was not a burst of random violence out of the fog. It was selected through intelligence gathered by traders. It was scheduled by the victim's own church calendar. It moved on stolen horses, spared the people it could sell, ransomed abbots for more than their weight in silver, sold saints' bones back to the people who worshipped them, accepted protection payments in butter, and eventually got hired by kings to raid other kings. The fire and the swords were real, but behind them was a system, and the system is the part nobody tells you about. The scariest thing about the Vikings was never the axe. It was the planning. If this is your kind of history, the parts that get skipped because they're inconvenient or just too strange, hit subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel does. And there's more coming. Next week, this channel is answering a question that sounds simple and isn't. What did Vikings actually do all day when they weren't raiding? Because the answer is nothing like the reputation. Subscribe and you'll catch it the moment it drops.